So the room seems to have thinned out. So we have the diehards here who are interested in the fascinating topic of valuation. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I didn't give this session its title, How to Value in Africa. JLL and myself we're not holding ourselves out as telling everyone how to value in Africa. So I've renamed the session Pricing in Africa, which I think really encompasses what I want to talk about a bit with respect to observations about pricing and observations about valuation, rather than how to value in Africa. So that's the basis on which I will progress. This initially was supposed to be a panel session, but it seems that it's now just me presenting, and I will try and, after I finish my presentation, open it up to the floor for not so much questions, but more for comments and to stimulate debate. So who am I? I'm Joshua Askew. I'm head of valuation for Sub-Saharan Africa for JLL, and I think that's all you need to know about me at this point. My mother always said to me that the best way to start these sorts of things was to tell a joke. So we may have some values in the room, so here I go. What do you call 100 values in a room? A perpetuity of values. Okay, well, thanks some of you for laughing. Unfortunately, from this point onwards, it's quite dry, so that's all the humor there is. So if you didn't enjoy that, you're in for a difficult session, I think. So really, what are our observations at JLL about valuation in Africa? And a lot of these observations come not just from me, but also from our capital markets team, who are constantly in these markets and questioned on pricing. And we rely a lot on our capital markets colleagues when it comes to understanding values and where the market is. In fact, I would probably go so far as to say that in conducting a valuation, your agents and your brokers are far more important than the valuer. The valuer is really just an investigator and a sort of reporter, journalist type character. It's really understanding the market and speaking to your brokers and agents, which is critical, not theoretical models and econometric ideas. So what are we talking about when we talk about emerging markets? All of this has been gone through before, but I'm going to speak a little bit about this anyway. We're talking about highly volatile markets where it's difficult to tell what will happen tomorrow, let alone 5 years in the future. And I think that that's something I've observed that valuers perhaps, and myself, need to remember in their approach to their modeling. There is a lack of transparency in almost all of the sub-Saharan African markets, perhaps a bit less so in South Africa, but across all these markets there are very few transactions which have taken place. And where there are transactions, it's very difficult to understand the metrics and the motivations of the different parties and to determine whether these transactions are actually open market transactions and to understand what the evidence is actually telling you. Unless you intimately know the transaction, it's very difficult to really use many of these transactions as strong evidence. They're perhaps touchstones, and they give some sort of indication of where the market is. But as I said, particularly of late, in the last year or two, there haven't been that many transactions in many of the key territories that the JLL and other members of this team have been, or other people in this room have been involved in. Very few transactions. So it's difficult to hang your hat on any particular transaction in any particular territory. Many of the territories we operate in are in recessions or are going through political difficulties, and that lack of stability has meant that there isn't that much, there hasn't been that much by way of international investment in these territories, particularly in real estate. So that's a problem. economic real estate performance highly correlated to commodity cycles. Yes, we've seen that all over Africa. I spent some time in Russia. It was very much the case there. The bottom fell out of the market overnight again after the oil price collapsed. That's happened in African markets too. In Nigeria, that certainly happened. IMF predicts that we're moving toward a recovery in Nigeria, but real estate activity and investment activity is very highly correlated to these commodity cycles, and that's something that needs to be borne in mind. So many valuers actually predict economic progress looking at the commodity cycle rather than the real estate cycle. So we'd look at when do we think that the oil price is going to rise again, and what impact would that have on these economies. Political risks hugely affects FDI and property market sentiment. We've seen that here in South Africa much as well. So these are all characteristics of territories, not just in Africa, but all over the world, emerging market territories. And they present unique challenges for pricing and for valuations. The challenges are largely similar all over the world. That's part of my observation, I think, the way JLL approaches these problems, and in fact, the way the international valuation community approaches these problems. Then we have what perhaps is misnamed here, irrational purchases. So what does that mean? I don't mean that some purchases in these markets are irrational. I mean they're notionally irrational. So if you are approaching valuation from a rational pricing model perspective, then some of the prices that are being paid for assets in all emerging markets can be or could be perceived as irrational. So if you adopt a direct capitalization or a discounted cash flow approach where you're looking at IRRs, etc., you'll often find that for particular types of property or particularly iconic properties, local purchasers will stroll in and pay twice or three times what a rational purchaser would pay if you were looking for a weighted average cost of capital return or a sort of an international hurdle rate of return as your IRR. And that also makes it difficult to value in these territories. So we've seen a lot of those sorts of purchases in both East and West Africa over the last couple of years. I mean, I've experienced it myself in Russia and in Turkey. I can remember a particular valuation conducted on a prime retail unit on Tverskaya Ulitsa, which leads down to the Kremlin. And on a rational basis, a potential purchaser would pay no more than 8% as an initial yield for the asset. But a local purchaser paid twice the value on a capital value per square meter basis. And why? Because they wanted to buy the asset and give it as a present to their son. It's an oligarch, because it wasn't on Tverskaya Street and it was iconic. So how do you price that into your thinking, into your modeling as a valuer? That is one of the challenges. And that takes me back to my original comment, which is that it's very important to rely on your brokers rather than notionally rational models of what someone ought to pay for an asset. What's far more important, I think, is what market participants will actually pay or are paying for an asset. And I think that that's perhaps a disjunction that needs to be given a bit more thought in valuation. And our capital markets team believe the same. They're seeing this spread between valuations and what can actually be achieved in the market grow, in fact. And I'll talk about that a bit later. So one of the chief criticisms of our profession that I have had to respond to, and people in my team, and I know that if there are valuers in this room, it would be the same for you. One of the chief criticisms when you go in to see a fund or a CEO for a large property company or investor, it's always, you valuers, you rely too much on textbook approaches. You've got no idea what's actually going on in the market. You've got no idea what people are actually really bidding for my assets. You come along with some sort of model which tries to predict what the value should be, but it's not based on reality. And I've had that sort of feedback, and I've had those sort of discussions a lot over the years. And I think that poor valuers, where they don't have that much market contact, or they don't have that much brokerage contact, as it were, in the market, they automatically rely on econometric models, predictive models, and valuation theory. And I think that in many territories here, perhaps there has been too much of a reliance on theoretical approaches and not enough focus on marking to market and actually trying to find out who are the buyers in the market and what would they actually pay right now at the date of valuation. So there we've got Damodaran. I've got nothing against Damodaran. Does anyone here know Damodaran? Anyone heard of Damodaran? Okay, good. Some people have. So what he does is he has a website. He's a US academic who has a website that that lists every year the country risk premiums that you should apply when calculating discount rates and IRRs and all this sort of thing. So the idea is you take a risk-free rate and then you add Damodaran's country risk premium on top of that, which actually, I'm actually quite a fan of that. I think it's pretty good. It breaks down at that point, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. But yeah, so he's pretty good. It is a bit theoretical, though, and that was my point in putting his textbook up there. Okay, so pricing and valuation. Don't ask me why I put Godzilla into this presentation. I just thought it would be visually interesting. So what have we been seeing in valuation, say, in the last year or so? Across sub-Saharan Africa and in South Africa as well, our capital markets teams and our brokers have noticed a huge disjunction and a spread between the values that are being produced by values in the market, and in some cases us as well, and actually the bids and offer prices that they're experiencing firsthand in talking to market participants or trying to structure deals or trying to get deals done. And the thing we've been asking ourselves, or the question we've been posing to ourselves, sounds very navel-gazy, doesn't it? But I've been thinking about this, and I think a lot of people in the firm, and I hope a lot of people in the industry have been thinking about this, is why is there this spread between the values that are produced, the valuations that are produced, and what real live buyers and sellers can achieve in the market? And I think that one of the reasons we have this problem is because of our assumptions about the future as valuers. Now, what I mean there, and we'll go into it in a bit more detail later, is essentially we all use discounted cash flows in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think that perhaps there needs to be a bit more wariness about the use of discounted cash flows. I'm not saying they should be abandoned completely, of course not, because our accountants and our finance boards and the bankers love them, and it's to some extent expected that we must value in this way. But I think there needs to be more caution. That's what I would observe. Another issue, which I think that we have observed in these markets, and I've observed it in other markets as well, is that we as valuers are not necessarily marking to market, which means that we're not reflecting what real live participants in the market would pay for an asset and accepting that as the value of an asset. So the concept of marking to market is probably deeply unfair, and it's, especially in the last financial crisis, it was deeply unpopular with landlords because it's pretty nasty, if you're honest about it. The idea is that it doesn't matter what you would be willing to dispose of your asset at, what level or yield or capital value per square meter. That doesn't matter. That's not the principle of mark-to-market. The principle of mark-to-market is that we assume the transaction will happen at the highest price a purchaser would pay in the current market at the date of valuation. And if you look at the new RICS Red Book, which was released about 2 months ago, which incorporates and is completely harmonized with the new international valuation standards, which is the textbook approach for valuing all over the world, you'll see that the definition of fair value which is the ultimate, IFRS fair value, the ultimate standard for mark to market, doesn't say anything about willing buyers and willing sellers at all. It talks about an orderly transaction, which is news to some people. And yeah, mark to market's not necessarily that fair, particularly if you're in a crisis or you're in a depression in your market and your asset fundamentals are very good. But it doesn't matter. The fact is that if no one is going to pay lower than a 10% initial yield for your asset, even though the sustainable long-term value of the asset, the through-cycle value of the asset is probably a lot higher, as values we have to value at the highest bid you could get in the current market. So, there's a whole big conversation there to be had, and it was had during the last crisis about underlying fundamental value or sustainable value over time. And I think that's a healthy conversation to have. But a lot of market participants don't want to accept marking to market. And I would observe that many valuers aren't necessarily marking to market, and that is something that needs to be thought about. And I think that leads to some distortions. Okay, not reflecting buyers in the market and what they will actually pay. I mean, these are variations on the same theme here. Again, perhaps an overly technical approach to valuation, not actually getting out there and finding out, well, who are the big players in the market who have the firepower to buy this asset, given its lot size? Who could achieve funding? Who is out there that can actually complete such a transaction now? What is their appetite? What is their risk appetite? What sort of returns, income or distribution returns are they looking for? Does it all make sense? And actually examining the market for your particular asset and saying, it's not a case of, oh, well, there must be someone out there who will require an IRR of 15 to 20%, and therefore they would pay this. That's not a useful or particularly useful way of looking at the market. It's I think, more important to look at market sentiment and actually examine who is in the market and who could complete such a transaction and who has appetite at the moment, which I think upsets valuers, because what that means is that you're not really that important anymore. Who's important is the broker and what they know and the capital markets guy. Not so much your economic model, which predicts utopia in 5 years' time, and then takes that utopia and discounts it to the present, and produces a value for what somebody ought to pay for an asset right now. Okay, so the responsibility of values is to reflect the market as it is, not how it ought to be. So that's probably a difficult message, because we're all guilty of doing that a bit. I at times am definitely guilty of it. And that's how I kind of got the picture of Godzilla in here, because this girl's talking about financial responsibility. I just thought it would be interesting. If I was Godzilla, I would definitely eat her and that city. Let's move on. Okay, so talking a little bit about cap rates. So this is something that our capital markets colleagues are finding more and more problematic in Africa, in South Africa and elsewhere. The concept of the cap rate and the fact that there seems to be a lack of rigor in the use of the term cap rate and the idea behind the cap rate. It seems a little bit to me to be like the ghost in the machine, or a metaphysical entity, which we'd all like to believe in, but does it really exist? That's the question. I'm not sure. Perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps it does exist, and it's all very clear, and I just don't understand. There's always that possibility. But there doesn't seem to be really any evidence of cap rates that we can see in the market, and there hasn't been for some time. What there is in the market, and in various sub-Saharan African markets, including South Africa, is there is initial yield evidence. Yes, some. But there isn't cap rate evidence. Because my understanding of cap rate and the way it's taught in uni here and in other places, it is kind of an all risks yield. It's a yield that somebody would pay for an asset if the current rent equaled the market rent. So if the asset was rack rented at a particular point in time. Okay, so that's interesting theoretically, and yes, you know, that as a concept that's a valid concept. But the question is there any evidence of such transactions in the market? And I don't see any. I don't see any sales of rack-rented properties at any point in time where, you know, the current rent equals the market rent. And I think inherently, because of the lease regime and the escalation regime that we have in Africa, it's almost impossible to find that kind of evidence, because there's always going to be difference between current rents and market rents because of the distorting effects of escalations. So I think that it's a bit like talking about one perfect moment in time, some sort of epiphany, which, yes, we'd all like to experience, but have any of us actually ever experienced that? No, not really. And there isn't that much evidence in the market of this thing. So following direct capitalization approaches globally, there is a thing called the equivalent yield, which is the time-weighted average yield between the initial yield and the reversionary yield on a direct capitalization approach. And a direct capitalization approach differs from the DCF approach in that it doesn't predict growth, and it doesn't apply rental growth, and it doesn't apply inflationary growth to costs. So essentially, you just have a yield curve, or you have an income curve without any assumptions about the future, really. So you build in your escalations, and you build in what you think the current market rent is, and at the end of the lease, the income will revert to that market rent, but then there's no assumption about growth. And also there's no exit yield, which means you're not guessing what the asset will sell for in the future, right? So that's a different approach to valuation. And actually, initially when I went to Russia some time ago, I was completely in love with that approach because I had experienced it in the UK and Western Europe. And then 6 years in Russia, excuse me, 6 years in Russia, I spent my time doing DCFs and actually came out of there a fan of DCFs. But I think both approaches have merit. But the idea is that the equivalent yield is the average return into perpetuity without assumptions about growth. And it seems to me that the closest thing in reality that a cap rate could be would be an equivalent yield. It would be possible to calculate these if we had a lot more data about the assets we're valuing or the assets that the funds hold. If they reported that data, it would be possible to calculate equivalent yields. So we could calculate the annual return that the funds are achieving as a percentage of the price they paid for the asset when they bought the asset. And maybe the IPD or SAPOA could collect this data and they could produce equivalent yields. But the point is that nobody really does that kind of analysis. So even if the cap rate is an equivalent yield, no one in the market knows about it, and no one has calculated it. So that leaves us, I think, in the position of saying, well, all right, what evidence is there out there? And the only evidence there is initial yield evidence, which is either the yield that is paid for an asset off a current income stream at one point in time, or the yield paid for an asset off the first year's projected income. And that is the only proof we have in the market. So I think that's something that we need to think about. And I have had conversations with, and we all have had conversations with the capital markets brokers, saying to them, well, what's the cap rate? And they say, oh yeah, well the cap rate is 8% for this asset. And then you say to them, when I say cap rate as a valuer, I'm talking about the value that a potential purchaser would pay for the asset if the current rent equaled the market rent for this asset as an all risks yield type thing. And they look at you quizzically and sort of go, no, we're talking about the initial yield. That's what we're talking about when we talk about cap rates. So I see, and we see at JLL, that the capital markets guys and the brokers, when they talk about cap rates, they're actually talking about initial yields, but the valuers are not. That's a big problem. That there's this mismatch, there's this misunderstanding. And I believe that it's probably wiser to focus on initial yields because that's the evidence we have. Okay. So that's food for thought. And I'm not holding myself out as a guru or something. These are really just observations that we've come across and we've been scratching our head. It's good to have different views, and if you think I'm talking complete bollocks, that's fine, I'll accept that. But I think we need to debate it and we need to discuss it, because I just don't think it can go on like this, really. I think there's got to be a bit more rigor and there's got to be a bit more clarity as to what we're talking about. Okay. So this is just something which I thought I'd include as sort of a boring slide. There's nothing exciting about this slide. So there's the all risks yield at the top, and there's some yield definitions. Actually, I don't know why I put this in. It's not particularly interesting. Yeah, so I think I've already talked about most of this stuff. But I'm just saying that an initial yield is not the same as a cap rate, and perhaps we shouldn't be talking about cap rates anymore. We should be a bit more rigorous about what we're talking about, and we should be talking about initial yields or all risks yields or equivalent yields. Or if you're talking about something else, you need to define it very clearly and then just explain what the evidence for it is. There's no point in saying, yeah, but the unicorn says we should sell it for X, when we're only seeing horses and zebras in the market. It just doesn't make sense to me. Okay, so just a few thoughts on DCFs, and a lot of this comes out of our experience as a firm globally, and thought leadership which has been produced in JLL as a result of the last great financial crisis, which was pretty savage in most territories. Okay, so during the crisis, the use of discounted cash flows was severely criticized by landlords across Europe, Asia, Americas, Middle East. And why was it criticized so much? It's not that there's anything inherently wrong with the use of a discounted cash flow. It's the way valuers used them, the uncritical way they were used. And I have seen valuation reports, and so have my colleagues, produced here in Africa with hysterically utopian assumptions. That's how I would describe them. So things like, is it really reasonable to assume in a territory that's moving into a depression, is it really reasonable to assume on a 10-year horizon 5 or 6% market rental growth compounding every year for 10 years, and then assume an exit yield which is 100 or 200 basis points lower than the yield an asset would sell for in the market now? The question is, no, it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable at all, but we still see these sorts of valuations taking place and happening. And I think that is one of the reasons that there is this miss between what market participants are actually willing to pay and some of the valuation results which are being produced. So it's a forecasting tool, essentially. I mean, if we're honest about it, really, a DCF is a forecasting tool, because you are projecting income. Some of it is contractual and you know about it, and some of it, you know about the escalations and you can model those. But a lot of it is just what the valuer thinks is going to happen in the future. And I mean, let's face it, valuers ain't that great at predicting the future. Nobody is. It's the old thing, the old adage, if I knew the future, I wouldn't be here, I didn't be in Barbados, blah, 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 that sort of thing. But it's really true. We're not good. Humans are not good at predicting the future. Almost nobody saw the great financial crisis and what that did to values and how that decimated the market. And many of us didn't really think in South Africa things would get this bad a couple of years ago, did we? I mean, let's be honest about it. We didn't. So we're not very good at forecasting. And, I hold a sort of secret view, which is now not going to be that secret anymore, which is that economics and econometrics and all this sort of thing, all these forecasts, the older I get, the more cynical I get, the more I start to think, well, actually, it's just maybe a sophisticated form of fortune telling. And you can't really tell what's going to happen tomorrow in a particular territory, especially when you're dealing with emerging markets, where you have such volatility, where you have such huge variances in local politics, rule of law, open institutions or lack of open institutions or civil institutions, where you have such huge potential policy discontinuities which can just occur because of an election, etc. It makes it very, very difficult, particularly in those territories, to use a tool which is aimed at forecasting, essentially. Again, I'm not saying it should be abandoned. I just think that we should think about it a bit more and maybe be a bit more critical in what we do with it. So, what is the solution if there is one? I don't think there is a solution except to be just more critical, but I think that one of the ideas that we're toying with, and I think others should toy with this idea too, is perhaps valuing both on quite a conservative direct capitalization approach without assuming growth, just using current market inputs and not assuming an exit value, not assuming market rental growth, and doing a DCF together. And this is an approach that we are thinking about and trialing in the space I'm in. And I think that there are merits for presenting our clients, and I think anyone who's interested in valuation, I think there are merits in looking at it both ways. For example, if you look at the chart up there, this was the income profile, the yield profile, the return profile for an asset we valued recently on a direct capitalization approach without the distortion, without the distorting effects of assumptions about market rental growth, without the distorting effects of an exit yield, which bumps up value. Now, if you look at the income stream, we've got $14 million, the top line currently. Then we see it drop to 12.5, I think. And then we have a whole load of expiries bunched together because the landlord didn't vary the lease lengths when they were negotiating the first bunch of leases at this asset. So they all expire pretty much at the same time. Rookie error. So they can band together and, screw you, essentially, as a landlord. Or they can all leave at the same time. So that plays havoc with your returns and your income. And you can see the income dropping to 11 million. And then maybe it gets better. And this is not a doomsday forecast. This was our view of actually what is going to happen at the asset. However, if you look at the same thing, making assumptions about market rental growths, what happens is the chart becomes much smoother. And all the peaks and troughs just disappear, like a nightmare turned into a dream, to a nice happy dream. And that is the point that I'm making. That is dangerous. And if a savvy investor looks at that asset on that basis and says, right, what do I know for sure? Not what are my assumptions about growth and about the future. What do I know for sure? I know what the market rents in the market that could be achieved are right now. I know about the escalations. And I'm going to predict maybe 25-30% of the tenants will leave. If I or there'll be a turnover or there'll be change in the tenants because the asset and the market is not performing that well. If I look at it on that basis, it's actually looking very, very dangerous. And this is hidden if you use a DCF approach. So what I'm saying is that perhaps we should consider both this very conservative approach to valuing assets, particularly if we're in markets with a lot of uncertainty and difficult, tricky markets, then perhaps we should be using this alongside the DCF, which is a bit more predictive, it's a bit more fortune-telling. That doesn't sound like a real word, but you get the point. And this is really just food for thought. It's really just to stimulate debate. Okay, so DCFs, the problems. Another thing that we've noticed, and again, the capital markets team have said to me, oh, Josh, what the hell is this? Look at this valuation, not ones we produce necessarily, or look at these assumptions. They look at this landlord's assumptions. Assuming a 15-year DCF holding period, 3 or 4% rental growth, compounding every year, and then a compressed exit yield. It's like, what are you smoking? I'd like some of that too. That's the problem. Is that the longer you push out your discounted cash flow for, and the more hysterically optimistic you are about your rental growth assumptions, the more distorted the result becomes. So what we're thinking about doing is only doing DCFs in territories which are difficult, emerging market territories that are experiencing turbulence and headwinds. We're thinking about only using 5-year horizons, unless there's some very, very specific reason why we have to use longer, because we don't believe that we're good at forecasting the future or forecasting what the exit yield will be. Maybe that means you won't use us as valuers, but just being honest about it. I think that it's a bit of a mug's game, really, trying to predict what an asset's going to sell for in 5 years' time. So in these difficult, risky markets, we're looking at reducing those periods, those holding periods, and those analysis periods. Forecasts, the Red Book says, and this is a paper that's actually now incorporated in the Red Book. It's VPGA 10, I think, in the new Red Book. It's about how to value in times of uncertainty. And it says that forecasts should either be based on current data or on market sentiment, demonstrable market sentiment, not guesses. So that's something just to, I think that's quite interesting. Because often if you ask an analyst or a valuer, where did you get your growth assumptions from? They can't demonstrate any evidence to support their growth assumptions or their exit yield assumptions. And that's dangerous. It's very dangerous. Growth rates and discount rates often don't align with reality. That is a comment that our investment advisory colleagues and our investment brokers often make to me. That it's got nothing to do with reality. And what they specifically mean, I think, is that it has nothing to do with the reality of return criteria required by clients, landlords, potential purchasers, funds, REITs active in these territories. That they're just sort of a bit made up, really. That's what they're saying. Exit yield should be based on, this is also from the Red Book, which I think is an interesting point. They should be based on current expectations, current yields in the market now, not really forecasting. But think about dilapidations, demolition, obsolescence, competition, repairs, sinking funds. So, if your asset is a great prime asset now, but you're doing a 10-year cash flow, in 10 years, there's probably going to be more competition in the market. There's a good chance that there's going to be dilapidations in your asset, potential obsolescence, repairs required. Unless those have been explicitly factored in, I think that it's probably a bit wrong to assume the same yield will be achieved as you're assuming now, or an even lower yield would be achieved. Of course, you have to take into consideration, as we all do, the state of the market. So if you're in the doldrums and you have a first-class prime asset which wouldn't sell for much now because you're marking to market, then it is, of course, possible that it could achieve a lower yield and therefore a higher value on exit in 5 years' time when an economy has improved. But all I'm saying is that you need to be cautious about these things, because purchasers are cautious about these things, and they, the investment analysts and grown-up funds, etc., who are going to go into territories that are perhaps risky in Africa, don't necessarily make lots of assumptions about the future, and don't necessarily make very optimistic assumptions about market rental growth. So we shouldn't either. Okay, and then I just wanted to add this is talking about how discount rates are justified and calculated, again, a problem. We all know about the weighted average cost of capital, and the capital asset pricing model. So that's the next bit. So yes, weighted average costs of capital are useful and interesting. They're touchstones. But I've seen many valuers adopting their landlords, the fund that they're valuing for, adopting their weighted average cost of capital as the return required by the market. It's very subjective just to a particular company. It doesn't represent what the market would apply as a discount rate. it's essentially useful for a calculation of worth or an investment value, but not really for a market value. So, scratch that one. Cumulative method, talking about Damodaran and others again. So the idea being that you build up your discount rate, just like you're building a Lego tower, and you take your risk-free rate, and then you add your country risk premium, and then, we've got a problem after that. At that point, it starts breaking down. Because then you're supposed to add other macroeconomic risk premia, and then microeconomic risk premia, and then premiums relating to the asset itself and the sector itself. All of those are very, very subjective and difficult to prove, difficult to evidence. So, saying that they're subjective is a polite way. If I wasn't in a big room with all you people and I was talking one-to-one, I would call it something else, not subjective. But you take my point. It's a bit made up. And it's dangerous for that very reason. I think that auditors do tend to like them. I apologize if there are any auditors in the room, but it gives the impression that something which is actually a skill and an art and all about understanding the market gives the impression that it's very scientific. And maybe the base stages are quite scientific, but as soon as you start to get into the specific risks related to the asset class and the asset itself, it just becomes very subjective. So why use that method? It's no better than any other method. It's just pseudoscience. It's sort of snake oil, something like that. All right. And my favorite approach, and I think the favorite approach by many values internationally, is actually to have to know your market and to know your clients and to know their IRR return criteria and their minimum hurdle rates of returns, which means, again, either you as a valuer have to actually be talking to your client a lot, and your clients in the market, to get an understanding of what their assumptions are, what IRRs they require, or your brokers need to be, and you need to be talking to your brokers. So the game is about understanding who's in the market, what returns are they looking for, could they buy the asset? That's what it's all about, not all this theoretical stuff that comes from the business schools that have spread all over the world with their theories, some of which are good and useful, but I think that these models and theories are useful only insofar as they describe the market reality. As soon as they stop describing the market reality, they're not that useful anymore. They should be abandoned, or they should be taken with a pinch of salt. Okay, so final thoughts just to wrap it all up. Market pricing, what we were kind of saying, our observation to stimulate debate is that market pricing and valuations must converge. If they're not converging, then we're not getting it right. Valuation is about understanding buyers. You need to know your buyers. And I think there needs to be a renewed focus on that. And this would be the same in any territory, really. So it's the same whether you're valuing Battersea Power Station, Canary Wharf, the Moscow City mixed-use development, Landmark Village, Tattoo City, Echo Atlantic, V&A Waterfront, Melrose Arch, whatever. It doesn't matter what you're valuing. It's all the same. The same principles apply. You must understand who are the buyers and what would they pay. And I think we need to take the valuation business to some extent back to the market, rather than talking about theoretical creatures like cap rates, etc. Okay, modeling, of course, must be responsible and less forecasting. So those of you here who are clients or landlords, etc., even internally, just start interrogating those assumptions, those growth assumptions and those exit yield assumptions. The exit yield and the exit value, the terminal value, whatever you want to call it, is responsible for masses of the value when it's PV'd, a huge component. If you get that wrong, it's all wrong. And essentially, you're just guessing what the value will be at sale in the future. So that's very dangerous. Valuers must talk to agents, brokers. I think that's very important. The brokers are more important than the valuers. That's what I've got to say, which is a sad reality, but because we think we're cleverer than them, but actually I've come to realize that we're not really. Valuers are investigators and reporters, not fortune tellers or econometricians. So those are some observations, some of my observations from the market. And then finally, I just thought I'd tell you who I am, because I haven't done that yet. So I was sent here probably about 8-9 months ago by JLL, and before this I was head of valuation in Russia, and for Russia and the CIS, which is that stuff on the map. You can see I actually have been to Kazakhstan. It's actually very nice, Kazakhstan. I recommend it. I've been to Georgia, also very nice. Ukraine's nice too. I haven't been to Belarus. I went to Mongolia, I would not recommend going to Mongolia. No, don't go there. Don't go to Ulaanbaatar. It's a terrible place. So I was recently a director in JLL in London, responsible for shopping center valuations, for retail valuations. So that was good. You can see some of the clients I worked with. And I'm also I've valued in Turkey as well, and Germany quite a bit. I'm also a licensed German fund brief MLV valuer, which is, I was talking about earlier, sustainable value. The Germans have developed quite an interesting concept called the MLV, which is a mortgage lending value, which makes it sound like it's about residential, but it isn't really. They've created a sustainable value basis where instead of reporting market value, you do a calculation to produce an MLV or a sustainable value, which is a through cycle value, which is the long-term value of the asset without the distortions of market, commodity, or property cycles, real estate cycles, which is quite interesting. So, for example, if you were valuing an asset in Lagos, say a retail asset, a prime retail asset at the moment, the value is going to be down significantly on where it was a couple of years ago. But if you were then to do a sustainable value alongside it, you would get a long-term value which would be a lot higher again. And it would be nice for clients to be able to report both of those in the report, so that you can see that, oh, right, at the moment, the market value, because we're marking to market, is 30% lower, but the long-term sustainable value is actually a lot higher. So that means that your asset is still worth investing in. It's not an ugly duckling, it's just that the market's bad at the moment and there aren't many buyers. But fundamentally, it's a good asset, and you can see that the value will trend toward the sustainable value. So anyway, I thought that was interesting, so I did the course and got that qualification. Okay, so that's my background. And now I wanted to open it up for comments, and more comments than questions. I mean, I don't think that I'm a guru, I can answer questions, I can try, but more comments, yeah. Is there someone to hand out? Yeah, sure.
What is, coming back to your DCF periods, where you say you're short, what is your approach in calculating what DCF period you should use for new retail centers which are not fully lit in Sub-Saharan?
Okay, well, I think, and that's a very valid point, I think that if your asset is not stabilized, you certainly have to build, you can't have a DCF period which doesn't include stabilization. So I would think that, I mean, most assets that I've come across, I mean, even when we're talking about hotels, etc., which I don't value, but I know there are other people on the team who do, assets that have just been developed and take time to stabilize. We would normally assume stabilization by year 3 or 4. So the exit yield is still, even on a 5-year DCF, is still on a stabilized basis, usually. If for some reason it wasn't on a stabilized basis, then we would probably extend the period to make sure that we covered stabilization. But you know, if you can't let it to a certain level within 3 to 4 years, then I think you've got a severe problem, maybe with the economy or with the asset itself. So a lot of values actually include a sort of structural vacancy. You know, if for example, if market level vacancies are 5%, then there is an argument for including a 5% structural vacancy in your valuation going forward anyway. So yeah, I mean, that's just a side point, but I would hope that if you have a decent asset, if you can't get it let up to a stabilized level in 3 years, then there's probably something wrong there. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, okay. Yes, sir.
Yes, is it on? This is not a question, it's an observation. I think you've done a remarkable hatchet job on valuers in South Africa, and probably you're leaving the door open for Jones Lang to clear the market. Quite frankly, I found your whole dissertation patronising, to say the least.
Well,
And I don't know how long you've been in South Africa and valuing in Africa. I haven't got my CV, otherwise I'd put it up there for you to see, okay? But quite frankly, I think you did have done valuers in South Africa a total injustice. We know the things that you've been talking about. I was dealing with equated yields in 1970. We do understand these things, but you're implying that we don't. And I say, I think I found it patronising, I have to say.
All right.
Thank you.
Does anyone else here find it patronising? Please put up your hand. Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I apologize. That was not my intention. My intention was to stimulate debate. And I take your point, sir. I wasn't actually specifically talking about South Africa. I was talking about sub-Saharan Africa. My intention is not to offend anyone or to say that South African valuers have been doing it badly. I don't believe that. But I have seen some examples. I have seen some examples of problems or areas where there's some willingness. But yeah, I take your point. If anyone here feels offended, I apologize. And I'm not trying to clear the way for JLL. I think that there needs to be a wider debate about some of these issues. So all I can say to you, sir, is that I take your point, and I apologize to you if I've offended you, but that was not my intention. My intention is not to say that South African valuers, actually I wasn't just talking about South African valuers. I wasn't trying to say that South African valuers don't know what they're doing, not at all. My observations are about the whole of what I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa. So, point taken. Any other observations? I mean, I'd be more interested in talking about the points that I've made. You know, the content and whether you think that it's relevant or misguided, etc. But these are observations that I have put together over years. Here we go.
Hi. I think some of the points are somewhat misguided. I mean, some of the things you mentioned, it's really about garbage in, garbage out. I mean, you're talking about exit yield being higher. The way we do it being lower. The way we do it, if an analyst brought to my table a valuation with an exit yield the same or lower, I would immediately question that. It's not something that that should be. I think it's just what you've seen. I don't think it's anything that's profound or different to what most people already know.
Okay, well, I suppose that's probably quite true then, if that's your position. But I have seen a number of valuations in which I would say misguided assumptions have been made on exit. But if you are making sensible assumptions, then that's tremendous. The idea more is to stimulate debate about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing as valuers. But yeah, I mean, that's tremendous. If you are adopting a more sensible approach, it sounds as though you are, then that's great. And that's pretty much what I'm advocating, that there needs to be a bit more critical thought about some of these inputs and outputs. If it's not that profound and it's not particularly interesting, then there's no need to react to it. I mean, if we're all doing this already, then it shouldn't be too much of an issue. But I have seen, particularly in some of the other territories that I've worked in, I mean, outside of South Africa, I have seen some crazy assumptions which have led to incredibly high, ridiculously high values, all driven by problems with the exit yield that's been applied by the terminal cap rate. So if that's not the case with your business, that's tremendous. Any other observations?
I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that we will be releasing some papers from JLL on these positions, on these ideas. And what we hope to do is interrogate the difference between proposed cap rates in the market and what we're actually seeing as purchasers, being willing to bid for assets in the market. So I think that should be interesting and should stimulate more debate. But thank you for attending. And once again, if I've offended any of you, that was not my intention. My intention is to stimulate debate and for us to look at these things more critically, which I suppose can be painful sometimes. Well, thank you for attending.